Man, I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time, Mark.
Really? Yeah, but you wanted to find out about turquoise. Where's my stash? What do I got in the back? Right.
Turquoise, the vintage jewelry, and just down this whole rabbit hole of research. I just,
Well, I do have the stash. The problem is I keep the stash. We're
yeah,
talking we're talking turquoise here, folks. Nothing else. Just turquoise. Well, it's true, you run across it occasionally. And when you have those opportunities, you buy them. And I always have kind of just put it away when I get some good stuff. Not always. I mean, I sell to Navajo Silversmiths, all Zuni, Hopi, Ute, anybody who wants it if I get the right stuff that I don't want to keep. But I did my own
yeah,
line of jewelry for over the pandemic with the Sam Patania. Do you know Sam? Do you know the Patanias at all?
Sam. Uh,
Yeah, you should get to know them.
I
They
don't.
opened, yeah, they opened the Thunderbird shop in 1927 in Santa Fe, and then again in they opened the Thunderbird shop in 1937 in Tucson. So great stuff.
Okay.
I mean, and his grandfather, senior, had the
Uh,
best, right? He had the best stones of all kinds.
yeah,
Burnham and number
yeah.
eight and Bisbee and just by the way, we have Bo on today, Orland Joe's son, and he's actually Orland Joe Jr. But as he was telling me, everybody since he's a kid called him Baby Bo.
That's right.
Baby Bo. You're gonna love this. I've got a necklace that's like I should have worn it, but it's down to my chest that's got huge, it's all number eight. It's a nugget necklace of number eight,
Yeah.
all
Wow.
slabbed out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Early.
Recently got these two. I actually got two little matching pairs. The little red web.
Oh yeah, those are sweet. Yeah. Yeah, those
So,
are nice. What are those, like 20 carats?
they are actually no, they're about 15 a carat each.
Yeah,
So
15. Can't tell. It's like holding fish up, right? When you catch a fish, you
yeah,
put it in front of you. Oh yeah, it's monstrous. Yeah, no, it's not.
small.
A little small thing. So what did you want to be talking to me about, Bo?
Oh man, I mean, I can go. Uh, I have an interesting history with not only my life growing up with dad and living in the art world, but I kind of ventured off into my own world, exploring creativity, like in the music industry, and and that in itself was an entire journey that kind of molded, who I am today, and kind of reverting back into family and culture, and just getting into the jewelry. And I never thought I'd be a jeweler, at all, but it's just something that just fits so well with the way my mind works and my
Yeah, of course.
curiosity,
Yeah.
and everything just together. That's just what I'm doing. So,
Your dad would
but
probably have been saying, yeah, he's always going to be a silversmith. He's just got to go do all this other stuff with the music and get it out of his system.
yeah, he's like, we're just within a decade or so for him to get that out of his system, and then he'll come around. And eventually, I did. And it was funny because he made the comment one time. He goes, I wasn't really sure what you were doing out there for so long in California and Chicago and the music world, And but like I always knew one day you would come around to this art stuff, and so or at least more like traditional cultural side of things, with the artwork. So it's always funny to me that, I made this huge loop and
Right.
came back around, and I'm kind of back where I grew up, and connecting a lot of the dots,
Yeah.
traditionally, culturally, the art and everything. Yeah.
You were
So
you were born in Shiprock, is that right? In that area?
yeah,
Farmington or Shiprock?
yeah.
Where were you actually
Mhm.
born in Shiprock?
Yeah, I was born in Shiprock. It's where I spent my childhood, and then we moved over to another town, Kirtland,
Yeah.
um, Farmington, and then but that whole region that's where my whole family is and everything, and so that's home, and everybody's still there today. And from there, I moved on to California, Phoenix,
Yeah, I want to
and
hear
bounced
more
around.
about growing up though, because we just skipped over from I grew up as a kid and then I'm out on my own. I want to hear the whole enchilada, so to speak. One of the things
Yeah.
for me is interesting, and I really want to get your perspective on this. So when I see Shiprock, there's something about that mountain, that monolithic object that just moves me in a weird way. I can't say why. It's like Mauna Kea does for me on the Big Island. It's got some kind of energy force. I feel it. And I'm wondering,
Yeah.
does that, I mean, you grew up around it, you're around it all your life. Does it have that kind of sense to you, or is it a different feel? Or is it like, oh yeah, it's Shiprock?
Yeah, well, the interesting part about that, as far as the location of the actual mountain there, is growing up in Shiprock. I have a lot of family in Tis Naspas as well,
Yeah,
and a little further city. So when we would go occasionally, weekly, almost really, we would drive from Shiprock across the border into Arizona.
right.
Once we got past Shiprock, once we got near Shiprock, it was always a special thing for me growing up because I always loved, just the gigantic size and just the energy and just the size of the whole. Um, it's hard to explain because unless you go there and physically see it, you'll be able to feel it. But I felt that even as a little kid. So driving up to it and seeing it, I always enjoyed watching it, looking at it. And then going past that was when I really felt even more special stuff come in from those mountains near Tees and getting towards, my grandma and grandpa's region and really getting out there, a little more isolated. And that energy just followed past Shiprock. And
Mm,
so for me growing up, it was always special driving by that mountain and then moving on into the Arizona part of the reservation. And till this day, I still get that feeling. So
mm,
growing up, I knew it was always something special growing up,
yeah.
and we worked some things about it growing up in elementary and just with family and stuff, but that's home. It's something you grow up with in your life, and you don't really see or understand the complete history of it or where you're at, or the culture. And now today, like I said, when I go back, I really appreciate everything about the region. But yeah, that Shiprock in itself is very, very special.
Mm. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I figured it probably was, but I don't know, I'm just outsider looking in. But so
Yeah.
and you're
I mean,
Dene and Ute, right? That's your heritage, Dene and Ute. Yeah.
yeah. So my mother's side, Navajo, and my father's side, Ute and Navajo. Yeah.
Hmm. And so as a kid growing up, did you gravitate to one side or the other? In other words, because you got two separate cultural,
Yeah.
identities, right?
I mean, growing up, everything was Navajo on the Navajo reservation. The language, the culture, everything was there in Shiprock. Even just going to the grocery store, you would see all the baskets and rugs, and it was present, in everyday life. And so grew up very familiar with my Navajo heritage. And it wasn't until much later in life that we really started to connect with my father's heritage in the Ute, because that's it's a whole different type of tribal region
Hmm.
and location.
Yeah.
Although it's so Navajo, it's really that different. So much later on in life, when I kind of circled back and connected, dad and I really connected family connections there, up in Ignacio in the Southern Ute region, and now understanding both sides of the tribal aspects of my culture and kind of merging them together and having that kind of inner tribal mindset. I feel almost fulfilled
Mm,
at this point in my life. But growing up, it was very much just mainly all Navajo understanding.
right.
But I knew know, like Toyak and Ignacio. I knew the Ute were right there, but I didn't understand that. I was so that I had it also in me as much. So
Yeah. Well, you got all the kids around you. Everyone's Navajo. They're speaking Navajo. It's all, I can see how you can go. And probably as a kid, you're like, yeah, no, I just want to identify with this because I don't want any trouble too, right?
yeah, but at the same time too, my father's relatives, my aunts and uncles on his side, they had more Ute blood in them,
Right.
were around too. So I knew there was always something tribally different there, but I
Right.
just didn't understand it, but everything, the region, everything is just so close to each other, and the families get intermixed and intertribal.
Yeah,
Really,
absolutely. Yeah, I do understand it. I'm from New Mexico, so at least I have the sensibility, I think, of growing up and understanding more of those kind of things than your average,
yeah,
Belladonna maybe.
yeah.
So when you
So
were a kid growing up, right, you got a famous dad. So let's talk about your dad a little bit, just because, I mean, that had to be, his creative juices are insane and he's so gifted. But that
yeah,
also had to be daunting to have that, kind of person, even though he always impresses me as a very quiet, introspective, thoughtful man. But it's still to have that kind of artistic, genius working in your home had to, be daunting, I would think.
yeah. Well, no, it really, from my memory, growing up in Shiprock, where he started in his first studio, because he had a shed out back of our little trailer right there in Shiprock, and that was his studio. And he had a little wood stove in there, and he had his kind of blocks of stones and his indoor and outdoor working areas. So growing up and just playing in the yard and hanging out, we would go say hi to dad and run around his shop a little bit, be
Right.
out, chopping, chiseling his blocks out and shaping. And man, I remember being so young, but just kind of understanding what he was doing. Like I knew he was working, I knew he was creating, and I saw what he was doing from that young of age. And to me, that was normal. I thought other
Yeah.
parents were also, you know, and we had this whole studio out in the back. The studio is bigger than the house, pretty much.
Right.
So the whole working area I knew was important, and from that young of age, I knew it was special because we would look at the stones and we would play around the stone. I mean, talking major blocks of stone,
Right. I know.
playing around them, but he would just tell us what they were, show us, and he wouldn't go too much further into like, hey, watch me do this, or hey, this is what he wouldn't like really teach. It was just more of a presence, and I know he enjoyed us being so close and around, but that was his work. And when I saw what he was creating at that young of age, I just thought that was just normal, man. Like that's what people can do. I didn't understand the separation of how good he was as an artist, or I didn't even see him as an artist. He was dad, and
Yeah,
he
I
was
get it.
creating, and everybody creates stuff like,
Yeah.
so I didn't really, so it was a lot of fun at that young age.
And he also was doing silversmithing too at that time too, right? Right off. Yeah, or no, a little later.
I just about that. I know he kind of went a little back and forth and had some knowledge, but he really didn't get into making some, or at least going into the silversmithing stuff till about 2010, I think,
Mm,
2008, 2010. Well, he really tried to, you know, understand the medium and do some things. And from there, he did kind of catch on to some techniques. But most notably, he did catch on to the tufa casting because working with stone his whole life,
yeah, it's a natural, right?
natural thing that just
Child's
happened.
child's play probably for him in some respects.
Yeah, like what, this little block, Yeah, but yeah, it's working with the stone, and growing up later in life, and he would ask sometimes. I knew sometimes he didn't really want to push on us as kids to create or do art, or or be sculptors, but he would kind of say, hey, I really need some help on some stuff. And we would go in and sand stones or file or whatever he would need, and we would just do it because
Right. That's what you did.
not the natural ability for us. And he just literally would just kind of show us what to do, and we would just naturally do it, and we enjoyed it. And so that didn't come later till closer to high school or even like middle school age. we would start actually working on stuff with him in the shop.
Hmm.
But yeah, so with all of us having that experience with the stonework, at least for me, getting into the jewelry world and working with the tufa, it just is a natural thing,
Yeah.
for me to dive into. It was the perfect kind of entry point for me to get into the traditional jewelry world. So yeah, I mean, everything just kind of flowed and made sense, and I understood it. And once I translated into working with precious metals, I said, "Oh, I get this. Like, all right, I
But
can I can enjoy this." And when I started, I never stopped.
when you were a kid, like middle school and high school, were you interested in any of the arts or doing any of that kind of stuff? Painting or drawing or making jewelry
Oh,
or any of that?
yeah. So growing up, I'd say elementary, middle school, high school, I did have the ability to draw, and I really enjoyed sketching. But I did all of that at home. Before I would go to bed, I would spend an hour or two and just draw anything,
Right.
a video on the floor, the corner of the room, just whatever was in front of me. I was inspired to put on paper, and that carried with me through my entire elementary, high school years. Um, but I never really took the, I guess, academic route of
Mhm.
learning the art. And I had dad there always as a reference to ask him questions, and so that was amazing. And so, but I do remember in middle school, I did sign up for the art class there. And the art teacher knew dad,
Yeah.
was aware of us, of course.
Right.
And so I remember on day one of my art class, he says, "Bo, we're going to be doing some sculpting. I got soapstones for the students." And he says, "This stuff might be too easy for you. You're welcome to bring in some stones from," I'd be like, "Oh, sweet." So I brought in some files and the alabaster, and this was what, seventh grade,
Right.
and I had fun. But after that, it was like, oh man, that was kind of it. And so the teacher knew. He says, "Well, what I'm going to be teaching here, you might already know, or you might get bored." And I did. I got bored,
Right.
and so I didn't take another art class until high school, and that was the same experience in high school. As I went into the art class and what they were teaching, I said, "Oh gosh," I said, "I don't know if I could do this." And so I dropped the art class and went into the home ec class and started baking biscuits and sewing little stuff together instead. It was just, I don't know, the academic route was just so foreign to me that I couldn't, my brain just couldn't absorb it, and I couldn't apply it. And it felt a little locked to me, like the rules. And,
Right.
and so I just felt a little suffocating. So I had
Yeah.
to have that outlet on my own freedom at home to draw or sculpt or do whatever I was doing. And then later on, towards the end of high school, I started getting into music, and that's kind of where that seed started. So it was another creative outlet, where I felt there were no boundaries, and that kind of took its own route after that.
Well, and your dad had the same kind of sensibility with no boundaries because he joined the Cowboy Artists of America, right? And I'm sure that was like a big major step, right? That was a big deal.
Yeah, yeah, huge deal. And that was a big influence not only on myself, but my older brother Hiram, who's an oil painter.
Right.
Uh, Going to those shows, in Phoenix, and just seeing that caliber of art and understanding it at such a young age, was such a blessing, and it's such a golden part of my life that I always cherish, because I'll never forget those days at the early CA shows, and just be floored by the Turpinings, by the Roy Andersons, the Don Crowleys, and
Right.
you know, that is still in my memory. And physically, I remember just looking at them, just like, how, like, this is so amazing.
Hmm. I
And
probably
to
saw you
me,
as a
that's
young kid. I don't know if I remember it, but I probably saw you as a young kid, you know.
Mark somewhere in one of the shows.
So I can remember like for John Moyer's Josh, his kid, You know, I've known Josh since he was like, I don't know, 8 or 7. And, you know, now he's like 32. It's funny to watch that happen, that progression,
Yeah,
and how you take off into your own world, right?
yeah, yeah. And we had a little reunion, speaking of Josh and the Moyers, at the archery earlier this year. So
Oh, nice. Uh-huh. How old are
yeah,
you?
yeah,
How old are you, Bo?
40.
Yeah, you're 40. So young. Oh, just in the
Yeah,
beginning of your
still, still
career. Yeah.
baby.
You're still Bo.
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
in high school, toward the end of high school, I guess, that's when you got into music. And what were you doing? What kind of things were you playing? Were you singing? Were you doing sound mixing? What kind of things?
Yeah, so I picked up a guitar. My dad also has a musical background, and so
Yes,
does
that's
my grandmother. His That's where the music comes in the family. And he had an old guitar um, in his room, and I would kind of dabble with it from time to time. And then he showed me some chords and how to play a little bit, and I immediately took to it and just loved it. And classic kind of story. The bands that got me were like Guns N' Roses. The rock and roll. Just like I got the rock and roll bug at that age, and I was just so in awe and amazed by these guitar players that I really took to it, and never really took it beyond other than just enjoying it myself or trying to be a professional musician of that sort. But
Mhm.
always enjoyed it, and at the same time. I was really heavily in sports, but this is an interesting period because at that time I wasn't paying attention to any art, but I was still going to the Masters show, the archery, or the CA show. I was still very much going to all of these shows, but I wasn't paying attention as much to the art world at this point, and I wasn't drawing. I had completely stopped drawing for a couple of years.
Mm,
Heavily involved in sports, took up some guitar, and just enjoying being a teenager at that time.
mhm.
Um, and so then I went to college in Phoenix, and I think I only lasted 2 semesters because when I got there, I was completely confused. I said, I don't know what I'm doing here. I would love to take some art classes, but they're saying I have to take all of these other classes.
Mm,
I was really confused. I didn't know why I was going to college, but still continued to play music. And I met some other people in college, and I met this one guy in particular who recorded his band on a CD. And I just thought that was the coolest thing in the world. I said, "How
mhm.
did you do that?" So he explained to me kind of the process of this trade school he went to, I think in Houston at the time. And so that always stuck with me. And I had always that curiosity. And I started doing some research and started finding some documentaries on how records are made. And that took me by storm. Dropped out of college, moved back home for a little while, tried to figure out the pieces of what's next. And
Right.
probably within about 6 months, I told my dad I wanted to go to Los Angeles and do this thing. And he's just kind of
Oh, I
doing one
bet.
of the
Oh my God, I bet.
me all the way.
Yeah.
And that was the start of my, I guess, my first career, you can say. Um, I packed the car, left for Los Angeles, and joined this program to teach you how to record, as an audio engineer. And classic Hollywood story, I landed at the right place at the right time with the right people. And that was, I never looked back. And I spent 15 years in the music industry after that.
And so how did that happen? I mean, you said the classic story, but what was that?
So when I got there, there was a recording, a little recording program, Los Angeles Recording Workshop. It doesn't exist anymore, but I joined this class of probably 30 students, and all of these students went through this really, really intense program for about 4 or 5 months. And what happened is, if you completed the program, they would kind of spit you out into the industry for an internship.
Mm,
There's thousands of recording studios in LA, and everyone knew about this one place, and they knew they could get an intern from this one program. So I met a guy in the program who had already been really successful in the music business. He was working for DreamWorks, had already signed a lot of major bands, and he was wanting to become an engineer himself. And so, but he was kind of flying under the radar. He wasn't even really telling anybody what he was doing or who he was. And we became really great friends. And when we graduated from that program, I went to this small little rehearsal hall in Hollywood, literally in the middle of Hollywood,
Mm-hmm.
and my internship. And of course, with his connection and his networking and his experience, he went straight to the top, to like the biggest hip hop and R&B world, you know. And so we connected after the program. He says, "What are you up to?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm down here at this studio." And he's like, "What are you doing there?" I said, "I'm on my internship, you know." And he's like, "Oh." He's like, "No, no, no, no." He's like, "Come up here." I'm like, "Okay." And he says, "I'm at Larrabee." He says, "We're waiting for you. We got an intern spot for you. Don't worry about it." I'm like, "Well, I'm literally in the studio now." He's like, "No, just leave, go." Like, okay. So I literally walked out and I went up to the studio Larrabee, which is still the biggest hip hop R&B studio in the world. And that's where I got my internship.
Wow.
And I started, and it never ended from that point. I mean, first my first project that I was invited to help out on, going from an intern to a runner, and then uh, being invited into a production, a real production in the room as progress was going on, was the second album of Kanye West, his first single called
Mm.
Diamond. And it was late. I got invited into the room to help out around like 7 or 8 p.m. And we went all night because the song needed to be released in New York at noon the following day. So we worked all night long and got it done, and it premiered in New York at the right time. And I remember we were leaving the studio around 3 or 4 p.m., just done. I mean, 24 hours of work, you know. And I'm going home. I turn on the radio in LA, and the song is just right there on the radio. And we just finished closing the doors. And that's when I realized this is how this works. This is how this is going to happen. And anything goes. It's a moment like that. And that literally sparked the beginning of everything. And from then I just started working. I started helping more people out, and I'm talking, you know, just on that level of
Right.
hip hop world. And then I started to flutter into the rock and roll world, and I enjoyed recording instruments and drums. And you know, I really was taken to drums, and so I really dialed in how to record drums. And it took off. I mean, once you're in that community,
Yeah.
out in that world, and understand the musicianship and the technicalities of how to create a record, and molding and engineering sound, you know, the work can be endless. And that's kind of how it happened. And I just never stopped. You know, went home occasionally for Christmas, and that was about it.
Did your
And that
folks figure out did they go, what's going on? And you would tell them, did they even understand, the kind of people that you were working with, like Kanye West and those kind of things?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
Not really until about the very end of my career out there. You know, they really got a grasp. And I think the first moment my parents really understood, I was home for Christmas one year, and I had worked on a commercial. I can't remember what company it was. It was a Christmas commercial that I had worked on that summer. And when I went home for Christmas, the TV was on, and I heard that song in the background. I turned around and I said, "That's the thing. That's the Christmas commercial that I worked on." And everybody watched the commercial, and it was like 30-second spot, and I'm like, "That's what I do. Like, what you hear, I do." And I think that's when it kind of clicked with the family, like, "Oh, all right." And so that, you know, it took a little while for them to kind of catch on what I was doing, but it was a Walmart commercial of all things.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's, you know, it was, I mean, I worked on SpongeBob, um, a lot of film documentary scores. You know, it started to branch out into the film world a little bit. But everything to the core was a lot of rock and roll music. at that time. I'd say the chunk of my career out there, and 8 years solid of working in any genre you can imagine, engineering in Los Angeles. And then in 2007, I got a call to work with a band, unknown. Obviously, they weren't going to tell me right away. Unknown producer, they weren't going to tell me right away, but they just asked for my availability. And I said, well, that time period looks like it might work with my schedule. And I was kind of setting aside a month or two for this potential project. And I committed. I said, sure, I'm interested. And the studio called back, I think 2 days before the actual production started. They said, oh, by the way, it's the Smashing Pumpkins, and the producer is Terry Date, who is my personal hero. And my jaw just about hit the floor. Okay, wow, this is gonna be a big production. And it really was. I got there on day one, and they had trucks unloading massive amounts of gear into the studio, more than I've ever seen in my life. And I was just like, whoa, we're gonna need some help on this thing. And Terry was super awesome, super nice. But from the get-go, he says, how are you with tape? The old recording with tape. I said, I'm good. He says, okay, because this project is all tape. There's no computers. It's really, really old school. And it clicked in my mind, like, this is going to be a lot of work. I already knew. And so sure enough, day one, we get going right away. The band shows up, and we hit the road pretty fast, and start recording and getting to work. And so from that day one, I think we spent close to 6 or 7 months every single day, an occasional day off, working on this record. And that was the bulk of 2007. And after we got done with the record, they went to another studio to finish mixing and doing some overdubs and stuff. And I reconnected with the band, I want to say mid or late 2008, somewhere around there. I met up with them in Scottsdale, and they were on tour, still touring that record, I believe. And just chatted, caught up with the guys, and they said they built a studio in Chicago, and they would like for me to go see it sometime. And I didn't think they were serious. I said that would be great to come visit. Never been to Chicago. And a couple of days later, the manager called and said, hey, Billy wants you to go check out the studio in Chicago. I said, okay, I'll go up and see. And sure enough, I went up, and they had built a really nice place, major studio, and it needed a lot of work to get it up and running. And they asked me if I would help get it together for the next record. And I agreed, and I said, okay. And that's how I ended up in Chicago for about 5 years, working exclusively for the Smashing Pumpkins. So, and at this point, I'm about 12 years in, the music industry, doing this. And I knew in a way that this wasn't going to be, the longevity wasn't really going to be there, because I was starting to feel the fatigue, the wear, the passion was a little bit thin. It was a lot of work, but amazing experience. And so that's kind of where the peak of everything, well, not really the peak necessarily, because I had a lot of other amazing moments in my career out there, but that was just at that level that just sustained for so long.
Yeah, that's got to be hard because of all the stimulus, all the stuff that's going, responsibility. Plus, you're a kid from Kirkland who's living in LA and then Chicago. And those are completely and utterly different, with no Shiprock in the distance, nothing in the distance.
No fry bread, no Navajo tacos.
Yeah, that wears on you. I mean, I could see it, right?
It got to the point where I really enjoyed what I was doing, and it was nice to be in the business, away from the business.
Yeah.
And then actually in Chicago, in a way, was a little more relaxing, because getting out of LA and going into Chicago and just getting familiar with the town and enjoying the town a little bit, it was a little weight off the shoulders.
Mm,
Because in LA, and where I went, it was like studio, 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 studio.
right,
You go visit a friend. Where am I going to visit a friend? In a studio somewhere. Oh, we're down at Disney, or we're down at Capitol, or
right.
something. I'm always in a studio, you know. So in Chicago, it was very nice to just enjoy and relax and meet the people and enjoy the environment. So
And not
I very
drive,
much
drive,
enjoy.
drive, 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 because that's what LA is all about too.
Yeah, and so living in that world where, you know, the studio world was still top priority, the music was still top priority, you know, but I can actually have a little bit of a life outside of that. So I really enjoyed Chicago, and I still go back and really enjoy that town, you know, and LA too. LA is like my second home. So
So what are you, you're dealing with really famous, important celebrities, and you get to see what that is. That had
yeah.
to change the way you see the world somewhat. And also, even today, I would think you have, I doubt very seriously you get too excited to meet anybody famous. It's like, yeah, no, I've been there.
Well, it's a little interesting. Um, I think for me, my experience meeting a lot of famous musicians in particular, um, there's always that moment of wow, you know, I'm sitting here in the presence of someone who has done something that so many people connect with, and so many people enjoy the art that this person has made, you know. And I think meeting them as an artist meant more to me than anything in the world. And that is what actually fueled me to become who I am today, because they were 100% an artist. A great example of that is I worked with Jacob Dylan, Bob Dylan's son,
Mm,
and this moment was a great inspiration to me. He showed up at the studio, and I was the only one there, kind of prepping the room, getting things ready. And he showed up with just his acoustic guitar and his laptop,
mm.
and I had no information on what we were supposed to do. And he walked in, and he looked just as clueless. And I says, "Well, you know, who's drumming and who's, you know, what's the deal here?" And he says, "Well, I don't know. I don't have any songs." But he says, "I'll be here." And I'm like, "Okay." And I said, "Well, I'll get you set up in this room. You can, you know, set up your laptop, and I can get you ready with your acoustic guitar." And he goes, "Yeah, that would be good." He goes, "I guess I can start there." He truly had no music or no lyrics or nothing. And then so I was there with him for about 2 hours alone, and he went into the side room where I set him up, and he just started playing and kind of doing his thing. And then some guys started to show up, and these guys, these session players, are expecting music, you know,
Right.
to play, because that's. And so they show up, and I go, "Well, he's working on stuff," and all of them are just kind of looking at each other like, "There's no music." "Oh, there's no, he's working on stuff right now." And so by the end of this day, I think he had made 4 songs, lyrics, melodies, arrangements,
Wow.
every. It was just so incredible to see him do that, and it was for a movie soundtrack. So he was under pressure. He was under the
Right.
gun. These original songs for this movie, and so at the end of it, he goes, "I think we did good." And he says, "Well, I'll come back tomorrow and let's see if we can do some more." So over those 2 days, I think we ended up with 8 great songs,
Wow.
you know, that made the cut no problem. And so that was one experience where meeting him and working with him just as an individual, as a person, and see his art develop, you know, his ability to do that, that was one of the most inspiring moments that I had, you know.
Yeah.
And that's just one example over the span of those many years. And so I think for me, working with people of that caliber, I viewed them as true artists, almost like I saw dad, you
Right.
know, just to their element, just to see them work. I understood that. And I connected with that more so like, hey, you got to do your job, man. You got to, you know, record all this stuff and do all the computer editing and all that. Yeah, that was my job. But I was also paying attention to the artists, of who they
Right.
were and how they created. You know, that was really important to me. So that has always stuck with me. And I got stories for days on individuals. You know, Pete Townsend from The Who, you know, I worked with him, and amazing. Rick Nelson from Cheap Trick, same thing. Another just experience after experience. And so when I see these, it got to the point where when someone of that caliber would walk into the room, I would just get more excited to learn who they were. Because when those doors close to the studio, you're not working with that person. You're not working with the superstar. You're working with the true artists of who they are. And you have to be able to develop a relationship and trust, to create something. And it's a true kind of collaboration in that little room to have music blossom in the way. So it's very interesting. And so when actors would come in, it would be different. So it was like a different thing. Like, oh, you're an actor. I don't understand you. So it was very fun. It was very fun, very interesting.
Yeah. Did at any point, I mean, I know in Chicago, it sounds like you had this kind of epiphany, but at this point when you're working with these individuals that are so gifted and you can see their creative process and you're part of the creative process, did you go, yeah, I'm not, I should be making my own art. I should be doing something like this. This is what I'm supposed to do. I get what I'm doing here, but there's something deeper that I'm not getting for myself.
Yeah, that you hit the nail on the head there. So that I started getting that feeling before I left for Chicago in Los Angeles. It was more inner frustration, creative
Mm.
frustration. I did, there are, boundaries there. And yes, I am, a part of the creating the production as far as the sound goes. And I could make suggestions, I could kind of help steer, but it wasn't mine. It wasn't for me to decide. At the end of the day, we're working for the musicians, the artists.
Right.
So I would help them and get to that point to where they were happy, and then we would go forward. So for me, it did get to that point where I'm not a musician. I'm not a musical artist, but that creativity for me was building and building and building, and I was getting a little more frustrated. Like, man, and I never crossed that boundary of weaving what my thoughts or what my direction of what I thought a song or a part should go. I never crossed that boundary because that was not my world. That was not my art. And I really respected that. But it did get to that point where I'm like, man, there's a lot of work here. I love everything that I'm doing, but it's not something that I'm creating.
Mm.
And then maybe that's me just being a little selfish creatively, that just I think I was just really hungry to create something of my own from start to finish and put the stamp on it and be like, that's my art. And
Right.
I wasn't there. I was 3/4 of the way, but it wasn't my art,
Right. I
you
get
know.
it. And did you think at
So
that time maybe I should be making the music, or did you realize this is, these people are different than me, and there's something else out there I'm missing?
well, I always appreciated everyone's journey and path
Mm.
to how they got to that point. I mean, everyone from the old school, rock legends to the new metal guys to the new hip hop guys. I've always respected everybody's journey to get where they were. And I felt that my journey as an engineer, I felt that for me to move forward in that world would be producing. But still, that's not really everything, that I was hungry for. So that's where I kind of cut it off. And so uh, um, seeing, well, I guess what I'm trying to say is seeing everybody's talent, seeing everybody go from start to finish. I really wanted that for myself, but I knew that I didn't have that journey of musicianship. I understand music. I can play it a little bit, but I'm not a professional musician. And you
Mm.
do not necessarily have to be a professional musician, but I'm just saying I just didn't have that ability there for myself. And 15 years had gone by already. And so that's when the turning point kind of happened, when I reconnected with family and culture and hung around dad a little bit. And he introduced me to tufa casting, and that's when kind of that light bulb of
Mm,
like, hey, there's something here that you can kind of get into. And at that time I wasn't thinking of being a professional artist at all. It was just a little outlet that kind of opened. It was a little seed that was planted
mm.
that I gravitated towards because I understood it with the stone, and then I started getting a little more creative with it, and that's where that little door opened right there, and I
And
left this big world, and
yeah,
I just went,
yeah.
I 180, just
And so was that in Chicago? So you're in Chicago working with them in their studio, and then you start to, did you hit a point right there where it was like, I got to go back home and spend a little time, get grounded? What happened? How did that happen?
so I got sick in Chicago. I had a lot of physical things going on, and I left the studio, and I had a guy who could replace me because I knew I physically couldn't work him. I ended up in the hospital for 2 weeks in Chicago,
Wow.
uh, pretty bad, yeah, with pneumonia, blood clots, like physically really bad.
Wow.
So so in the hospital, my entire family came out to Chicago, to support and be there by my side. And it was during that time in the hospital where I felt I just need to go home. I need to go home. I need to recover, you
Mm,
know. And I could have easily just continued, you
yeah.
know, continued just like that. I could have gone back to LA. I could have done anything I wanted at that point.
Yeah. Sure.
I made the decision to go home and spend some time there. And that's when my dad showed me when I got home kind of what he was messing around with the tufa stone. And it caught my curiosity. It was that point right there. And I just never looked back. It was the same thing when I left for LA. I started something and then never stopped.
Mm,
And it
mm.
went
It
from
felt
there.
right. Right.
Yeah.
Kind
Yep.
of, kind of the hozo came back, right? It was something there
Yep.
that just clicked.
So same thing when I went back home, and dad's studio was perfect to work in with tufa, and I just went in and started messing around with it, started casting some silver, melting down scrap, just
Right.
doing what I can. I was like, this is pretty cool. I like, man, this is awesome. Then I started really learning the traditional side of it and the history of it, and that I gravitated toward learning that more, and that opened up the door to more culture and more historical research, and it just went from there. And I again, one of those things, I just didn't stop, and then I had to learn the technicalities of working with silver and precious metals. So that's another aspect about myself that I know is in the music world. Now that I understand myself more, is the reason why I gravitated towards that so much is because my brain is 50% creative and 50% technical.
Mm,
That pairing was so, it worked for me, you know, and so I can mold sound, but there's a technical side to do that. There's an ability on both sides you got to do,
right.
understand.
Right.
Same thing started to happen with the jewelry. I said, "Oh man, okay, you got the natural stones, great, awesome, but what is this metal here? Like, what's going on here?" So I had to start understanding the alloys, the flexibilities, the temperatures, all of that kind of technical things started to
What you love,
come out. And say,
probably. That was probably right up
yeah,
your alley.
it's right there. And I said, "Wait a second, I can put these two things together and start creating." I said, "That's it, okay." And I did tufa, and I started carving tufa. I've had about 1,000 mist pours, and not understanding.